Okay, everybody. Hope we all had a good weekend. We're heading into our last week of new stuff on the early modern era unit. Just two videos this week. What it's going to focus on is mostly the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so again, I'm giving you a tentative time period for this to happen, about 1780 to 1850. There's kind of two industrial revolutions. There's this one here, and then there's the one of the late 1800s, which happens primarily in the United States. That's what made the United States a world power. It was also influential in Europe during that time as well. Although the first one was a little bit more influential in Europe than it was the United States. Now, the Industrial Revolution again goes back to that connection, that one that I keep making, right? Renaissance leads to the Reformation, leads to the Enlightenment, leads to the French Revolution and Industrial Revolution. Okay, in other words, the Industrial Revolution is in many ways the culmination of everything that we see before, with um, religion tying science up less because of the Reformation, and the religious power structure beginning to change because of the Reformation, because of education becoming a priority as a result of the Renaissance, because the Enlightenment allows people to think in new and different ways. And then kind of the French Revolution, toppling of an old, long existing government in the favor of new ideas. The Industrial Revolution is all about brand new ideas, and that's what we're going to kind of talk about here a little bit today. But I want you to always understand how each of these time periods depend on the one that came before it, um, and allowing for these things to happen. Now, the Industrial Revolution isn't really dependent on the French Revolution per se. They kind of happen around the same time period, but they are dependent on the previous three: Enlightenment, Reformation, Renaissance. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Industrial Revolution. Essentially, it's the culmination. This is why it's the last real period we're talking about. It's the culmination of all the advancements that have been made before this time. Okay, we see it result in a lot of changes. The Industrial Revolution fundamentally changes the world we live in. Okay, um, we start to see massive increases in the production of goods. When goods become more available for people, people are able to have more things, have more goods. What is a good by definition? Okay, good is something that can be bought or sold or acquired from one person to another. With goods more available, that means there's more consumerism. That means economies are growing, right? We're talking about 1780 to 1850, and that early time period is when Adam Smith writes The Wealth of Nations, which talks to us about how modern economics is going to be different than before. Okay, again, what was the old way? Well, everybody depended on, what we call subsistence farming. Yeah, you try to sell some of your crops at market and something like that, but generally you're a farmer because you need to make food in order to stay alive. People don't have to do that necessarily anymore as jobs start to become more prevalent in industrial like places, and less so in the farms, but we'll get to that later. Roughly during the 1780s is when the Industrial Revolution really gets started, primarily in Great Britain. Why Great Britain? Well, number one, Britain had the most populous city in Europe, London. It had a lot of other large cities throughout its country. And it had the capability and power. Remember, Britain is the world's most powerful country at this time. That means they have the access to the resources. That means they have the wealth. That means they have the manpower to continually produce more and more and more goods. Okay, so during the 1780s begins in Britain. Now, again, the world before had always been a world um, that focused on agriculture. If you were a farmer, your father was a farmer, your grandfather was a farmer, your son was going to be a farmer, and your grandson was going to be a farmer. That's what people did. You're either a farmer working for somebody else, a farmer with very little working on your own, or you were somebody of influence and power that was a noble, or you're in the military. Those were and then you had a few other people that were like blacksmiths or tailors or carpenters or something like that. But I mean, those were the only jobs out there. The average person, if you ask them what they were farmers. Was the case in the world. It had always been the case in the world. For all we know, will continue to be the case in the world at this time. But the Industrial Revolution changes that. Okay. What we call industrialization by definition is the process by which a nation's economy shifts from agriculture to manufacturing. In other words, from farms to factories. Ultimately, by the end of the Industrial Revolution in both Europe and the United States, by 1900, factory jobs, labor jobs as we call them, would overtake farms as the number one occupation of all people in the world. Okay, farming had been the number one occupation of everybody in the world for 5, 6, 7,000 years. Now it's labor jobs, making steel, building railroads, ultimately making cars later on, making other goods, weapons, machines, um, ammunition, uh, all of that stuff, right? So how else, and I want you to think about this before we go on, right? How else is this going to change the world we live in? Okay? I'm thinking about farms to factories. What does this mean about where people are going to live? And how is that going to affect the relationship that people have with one another, right? Think about that. And we'll get into that here in a second. So, you see all of these inventions and new ideas and things that are coming around during this time, right? Many new inventions that increase the production of goods, which ultimately creates jobs and lowers costs. For instance, ultimately what we talk about is the assembly line, but we're not quite at the assembly line yet. But when we use machines to make goods, goods can be made faster. When we can make them faster and they're not as specialized, they can be made for less of a price. That means people can now acquire them more easily. For instance, used to not be able to have nice clothes, but now James Hargreave invents something called the spinning jenny, which produces yarn in much greater numbers and greater qualities, meaning you can churn out clothes quicker, meaning you don't have to go to an expensive tailor to get clothes made, meaning you don't have to make clothes yourself because we can begin to mass produce clothing cheaper and easier, meaning average everyday people can have clothes, can buy clothes. What industry is this going to help in the long run? What new industry aside from just the jobs created by making clothes in great numbers, what other kind of cottage industry of that is this going to create? The fashion industry. Because now that we make clothes in great numbers, we make a lot of clothes that look the same. So we see fashion trends develop. Okay, we see fashion trends develop for the first time, and that's why you'll see when you look at people, pictures throughout history, you know, fashion trends, if we want to call it that, from one period to another seem to last like 100 years. Then we get into the late 1800s and into the 20th century. You can see kind of almost decade to decade and tell what time period somebody is from, what decade they're from, just based on what they're wearing. Why? Because fashion trends change and become more commonplace as clothes become easier and easier to make. Another big invention is James Watt inventing the steam engine. Okay, um, basically it's a device that can be used for a lot of different reasons. And it's probably the most important invention that comes out of the revolution. What do we do with the steam engine? Well, what does it run on? It runs on steam power, which oftentimes can be water. So what do we see? We start seeing factories built that are near a significant source of water. That's why every big city, if you think about every big city is on some source of water. Okay, uh, at least old school big cities, right? Think about it. Boston, it's right there on the Charles River. You got Pittsburgh, and it's got three rivers right there by Pittsburgh. You've got New York City, is right there. You got the Hudson River and the ocean right there. You've got Cincinnati on the Ohio River, St. Louis, the Mississippi River, Cleveland, Detroit, Buffalo, all on Lake Erie, Chicago, Lake Michigan. Okay, uh, cities grow large because they're near a large source of water. Okay, so what happens is people build factories up in these cities that run on steam power. They use the steam, the hydroelectric power to run the machines and things in their factories, and people flock to those cities to get jobs, turning these regular cities or towns into bigger metropolises over time. So we see that affect the growth of cities as a whole too. Another important development, we have something called puddling. A guy named Henry Corp comes up with this system of puddling that helps improve the quality of iron by removing impurities from iron. Now, iron has a lot of impurities in it. What impurity things are just like something that makes it not pure iron. So, like for instance, if you looked at a piece of iron, just a regular piece of iron that was made into like a knife or a sword or a shield or a fork or whatever, you'll notice that it's not even in a lot of places and it's very lumpy. Those lumpiness spots there are impurities. The system of puddling is a way to help remove those impurities from the iron and make it a stronger substance. Okay, because unfortunately, when you have those impurities in the iron, it erodes away at the iron and makes the iron overall weaker and not be able to you know stand up to as much weight or be around as long. So that's a big problem. So we want to take that away. Obviously, because of the steam engine, it leads to growth in transportation. Steamboats and railroads by the 18 teens and 1830s greatly improve and quicken up transportation. They also create tons of jobs in building canals, in building railroads. Okay, taking what used to be, um, you know, a very, very long trip from one place to another to seemingly take a much less time. Okay, so steamboats and railroads, we greatly improve transportation, making getting from point A to point B a lot easier. It's a process I like to call shrinking distance, right? People rarely go further away from their homes than a few miles in a lifetime. Well, now suddenly, that daunting idea of going on a several days trip from northern part of England to London goes from impossible to something that can be done in a day or two. So uh, basically, like I said, it starts in Britain and it grows throughout much of the rest of Europe. The only other European country that probably benefited quite as much as Britain was Germany. And Germany and the United States were probably the two biggest countries involved in the second industrial revolution that goes from about 1875 to about 1900. Uh, Another outcome of the Industrial Revolution is we see mortality rates or death rates get lower. Okay, how does that happen? Well, because we learn more as people move to cities. One of the big problems is the spread of disease. Interestingly enough, as we see virus and stuff in the news today, but one of the big factors is we see death rates go down significantly as people learn more and more about how illnesses can spread, whether it's through a contaminated water well. Like there was a big influenza outbreak in England during the early 1800s, and they couldn't figure out where it was coming from, and they realized it was a contaminated water well. So all the people, so they stopped letting people use that water well because they were spreading the virus all through London. Very eerily similar to what we have today. There was no such thing back then as social distancing and shelter in place and all that good stuff. So very different world then and now, but when we discover disease and have a better understanding of disease and how that works, we find better ways to combat it. So with more people living in a more closer space in the cities, we're able to come up with new and different ways to combat, death and mortality rates throughout Europe. All right, so what are some of the big impacts of the Industrial Revolution? Okay, so obviously one of the big ones is we have the emergence of big cities. Okay, there's always been big-ish cities, but there's always been big-ish cities, but not like massively big cities like New York and Tokyo and stuff we have today. Not since Rome. It's finally as a result of the Industrial Revolution that we start to see cities with populations of more than 1 million people. The first, of course, in Europe to do this is London. They have cities like Paris, Madrid, Spain, Rome again, New York City, places like that. So we see population growth happen in big cities. What's another effect of population growth? People get together, people converse more, people share ideas, and through the sharing of ideas here leads to more inventions and more innovations and more modernization of the world around us and more discussion on ideas that can impact the future of society. Okay, we see a new class system begin to form. The old class system where the peasants, the merchant class, and the wealthy and nobility. Now we start to see new classes form. We have the wealthy, then we have the business class or the middle class. Then you see the what we call today blue collar workers, industrial classes of workers, and then ultimately poor peasant farmers and people like that. Again, this doesn't happen ultimately worldwide till around the turn of the 20th century, we'll say about 1900-ish. But we ultimately see for the first time in history since the beginning of agriculture, since the agricultural revolution started 5,000 years BC, we see factory work finally replace farms as the most popular job market out there for people. Okay, factory jobs, although they didn't pay necessarily well in all cases, they did provide more consistent money for average people, right? If you have a bad season as a farmer, you're screwed and you lose everything. Now, you may not get paid a lot of money working in a factory or a coal mine or whatever, but at least you consistently have money coming in, and you're able to hold down a job for, as long as you're willing or able to do it, unless you get fired or something. We see the emergence more and more of big business concepts that come also in part of what Adam Smith said in The Wealth of Nations. Free market economy ideas, factory owners starting businesses and building up their wealth, whether it's somebody that makes money in the railroad business or later on in the steel industry or oil or whatever that industry might be. Or coal mining, we start to see a lot more money being able to be made by people in these areas, right? So what is the negative outcome of this? Okay, well, we see the emergence of a new political ideology called socialism, right? And who is the father of socialism or the father of communism? Because socialism and communism are very similar. Socialism is the political system, while communism is the economic system. The person responsible for this was Karl Marx, the father of communism, who writes his book, Communist Manifesto, in 1848. This will be our last point for today. So Karl Marx in 1848 writes that's bad for them. I don't know why I keep doing this, folks, because I'm really bad at it, but 1848. So 1848, the Communist Manifesto. Karl Marx writes about how the industrial class of workers, right? The industrial class of workers here is going to rise up. Okay, what he calls them is a common term used for industrial workers at the time. They call that for average people called the Lumpenproletariat. The average person is going to rise up against the wealthy, the bourgeoisie, and there's going to be a bloody revolution. Right? And this is writes in the Communist Manifesto that there's going to be a bloody revolution, and the proletariat is going to come and take over and kick all the wealthy people out of power and out of government, and then they're going to rule briefly and then disband, um, and leave people to govern themselves. Is the general idea of Bernie Sanders. I mean, sorry, of Karl Marx. Um, so again, what he's talking about here are class issues and class struggles between groups of people. Okay, Karl Marx believes that our entire history, um, that our entire history is kind of based largely in the struggles between uh, the classes, and again, that is kind of where his um, that's kind of where his viewpoint is. Now, in its purest form, communism sounds like a great idea in the mind of Karl Marx. Okay, uh, everybody will leave. Everybody will give up power willfully, and the people will rule themselves after his bloody revolution. But the reality of communism is it doesn't quite work out that way. When someone is put in power, they're unwilling to give it up. So, uh, so anyway, we're going to shut things down there. We're going to have one more video for Tuesday that I'll put up tomorrow, and hopefully you get a chance to watch this. I'll send it out to you guys later on, and let's have a good week. All right. Thanks.